For decades, action films have shaped our image of villains as unrelenting figures defined by brutality, dominance, and the kind of cold resolve that leaves no room for sympathy. But what if those terrifying characters weren't always meant to be empty vessels of evil? What if, long before the final edits were locked, these villains carried emotional depth, personal tragedies, and motivations that could have completely altered how audiences viewed them? Those versions existed, just not in the movies we saw. Inside early drafts, buried in unused scenes and abandoned character notes, many of these antagonists were written with rich backstories that explained everything: why they embraced violence, why they despised the hero, or how their darkest choices had been shaped by wounds that never healed. These glimpses into their pasts were designed to make them more human, more layered, and in some cases, more tragic than the protagonists themselves. But studios rarely gamble with moral complexity. Executives feared that revealing too much would shift sympathy away from the hero. Test audiences sometimes reacted with unintended compassion toward the antagonist. And in the fast-paced world of action filmmaking, nuance was often viewed as a burden, something that slowed momentum or complicated marketing. So those stories were erased. Entire childhood flashbacks disappeared. Conversations exposing emotional scars were cut. Motivations once central to a character's identity were rewritten or removed altogether. The villains that arrived in theaters were only fragments of who they were originally meant to be. In this episode, we uncover 15 action movies where the villain's backstory was removed before release, hidden arcs, unseen drafts, and emotional foundations buried beneath studio decisions. These lost origins reveal something astonishing. The villains you thought were born evil were never meant to be that simple. Let's bring their forgotten stories back into the light. Fact 1. Out for Justice. In Out for Justice, Richie Madano is remembered as a wild, drug-fueled menace, a loose cannon whose violent behavior seems to erupt without rhyme or reason. But the earliest drafts of the script painted Richie in a very different light, revealing a man shaped by years of neglect, insecurity, and emotional abandonment long before he ever picked up a gun. Originally, Richie wasn't meant to be a one-note madman. He was written as someone who grew up idolizing Gino Felino, seeing in him the kind of strength and stability he never found in his own household. A removed sequence traced Richie's troubled beginnings, a household riddled with rage, a father who exploded at everything, and a mother who endured it all in silence. It was here, in this environment, that Richie learned to equate survival with chaos. One deleted flashback showed a much younger Richie attempting to break free from the criminal path. He sought help, tried distancing himself from toxic influences, and even attempted sobriety. But years of trauma and self-doubt dragged him back down. His descent wasn't meant to feel random. It was intended to reflect a lifetime of emotional wounds resurfacing violently. Yet when early test audiences reacted with an unexpected sense of pity toward Richie, the studio grew uneasy. They feared that layering Richie's character would interfere with the film's clear hero versus villain dynamic. As a result, the entire emotional foundation of his character was removed in the editing process. What remained was a villain defined by madness. What was hidden was a man collapsing under the weight of his past. Fact 2. I Come in Peace. In I Come in Peace, Tallac appears as an unfeeling alien hunter, an unstoppable force collecting endorphins with mechanical precision. But the character's original conception was far more layered, built on the desperation of a being whose world had been pushed to the edge of extinction. Early drafts described Tallac as a soldier from a dying civilization, fighting against a catastrophic interstellar conflict that left his species scattered and vulnerable. His mission on Earth wasn't meant to be senseless brutality, but a ruthless act of survival. One removed sequence revealed holographic memories of his ravaged homeworld, a stark reminder that Tallac was fighting for the survival of what remained of his people. Another abandoned storyline connected Tallac to Azek, the alien pursuing him. Instead of being strangers, the two were once comrades, torn apart by war and forced into opposing roles. Their confrontation was meant to reflect the tragedy of a shattered civilization, not just an intergalactic chase scene. But this emotional depth didn't survive production. Executives worried that humanizing Tallac would make him less intimidating, weakening the film's atmosphere of relentless threat. They wanted a villain whose intentions were simple and terrifying, not one shaped by grief and desperation. The result was a hollowed-out version of Talek, stripped of purpose. But beneath that edit lay a warrior fighting for the last breath of his dying race. Fact 3. Bulletproof. In the final cut of Bulletproof, Colonel Cardiff comes across as the archetypal 80 Seconds villain, callous, power-hungry, and obsessed with weapons. But the script's original take on Cardiff told a story not of greed, but of betrayal and emotional collapse. Early drafts positioned Cardiff as a decorated operative who once led a covert mission meant to protect national interests. But the mission went horribly wrong. His team was stranded, overwhelmed, and ultimately sacrificed to safeguard political reputations back home. A removed flashback showed Cardiff standing among the bodies of his fallen men, realizing that the government he served had abandoned them. Another cutscene explored Cardiff's survivor's guilt. He questioned his loyalty, replayed the failed mission in his mind, and drowned under the weight of decisions he couldn't change. His shift into arms trafficking wasn't about profit, it was rooted in a shattered belief system. He no longer trusted any institution, convinced that power was the only currency that would never betray him again. However, producers feared that portraying Cardiff as a fallen hero would blur the film's moral clarity. They wanted a straightforward villain, not a man broken by the machinations of politics. So Cardiff's emotional core was erased. What remained was a simplified antagonist. But behind the scenes, his story was that of a soldier crushed by the system he once served. Fact 4. The Perfect Weapon. In The Perfect Weapon, Yoshida emerges as a sharp, intimidating Yakuza figure, calculated, refined, and seemingly devoid of emotional vulnerability. But hidden beneath the surface of early drafts was a drastically different man, one shaped by years of internal conflict and a fractured sense of identity. Originally, Yoshida was written as a child born between two worlds, never fully accepted by either. His mixed heritage made him a target of ridicule and alienation. One removed sequence depicted a young Yoshida sitting alone in a school courtyard, overhearing insults from both sides of his lineage. This feeling of never belonging became the quiet fire that fueled his adult ambition. A deleted moment deepened this wound further. Yoshida visiting his mother's grave, leaving behind a small origami figure she once taught him to fold. The scene portrayed him not as a cold villain, but as a man haunted by loss, desperately searching for a place to anchor his identity. In the original confrontation with the protagonist, Yoshida drew parallels between their journeys, two men molded by rejection and discipline, each choosing a different path to survive. But producers felt the emotional weight risked complicating the narrative balance and overshadowing the hero. So the studio carved away Yoshida's humanity, leaving behind the sleek, ruthless persona seen in the final cut. His on-screen version was an enforcer. His original form was a wounded outsider fighting to reclaim a sense of belonging. Fact 5. The Peacekeeper. In The Peacekeeper, Dragan Svoboda is portrayed as a calculating extremist, willing to ignite chaos with military precision. But the early vision for his character revealed someone profoundly shaped by grief, someone whose descent into violence was not ambition, but agony. Initial script drafts established Dragan as a survivor of brutal ethnic conflict. A removed flashback depicted him kneeling in the ruins of his childhood home, cradling the body of a fallen friend while smoke curled through shattered rooftops. This moment was designed to anchor the audience in Dragan's pain, showing that the world he came from had already collapsed long before he ever became a threat. Another abandoned narrative explored Dragan's strained relationship with a former commanding officer who manipulated mission intel, leading to unnecessary casualties. Their confrontation, planned as an intense, emotional clash, was meant to expose the betrayal that severed Dragan's last thread of loyalty. His radicalization wasn't rooted in ideology. It was born from heartbreak, loss, and a belief that no institution would ever protect him again. However, the studio feared that giving Dragan such emotional complexity would soften his menace. They wanted a straightforward antagonist who would heighten the stakes without requiring empathy. So his tragedy vanished in the edit. What remained on screen was a rigid extremist, but the original Dragan was a grieving soldier carrying the ashes of his past. Fact say, Black Eagle. In Black Eagle, Andre, played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, strikes the audience as a focused, uncompromising operative, sculpted purely for violence. But the earliest drafts provided a glimpse into a much more tragic figure, one molded by a lifetime of forced conditioning and internal conflict. Originally, Andre's upbringing was steeped in state control. He was taken from his family and placed in a Soviet training program designed to forge children into weapons. A cut flashback depicted him staring at a faded photograph of his parents before it was confiscated and destroyed, a symbolic moment showing how the system severed every personal tie he once had. Another removed subplot explored Andrei's growing doubt as he began noticing corruption within the KGB. In one version of the script, he hesitated during an assignment, allowing a civilian to escape. This moment of defiance, subtle yet powerful, was meant to reveal the human conscience struggling to break through years of indoctrination. However, producers wanted Andrei to remain an unstoppable force of nature, a physical threat without emotional nuance. Van Damme's rising star power was tied to his martial abilities, so the studio eliminated anything that softened Andrei's presence. The final Andrei is a hardened enforcer, but hidden beneath that image was a stolen childhood, a silenced conscience, and a man shaped by a system that never allowed him to be human. Fact 7. Rapid Fire. In Rapid Fire, Kinman Tao commands the screen with elegance and cold authority, a crime lord who feels untouchable and emotionless. But the earliest interpretations of Tao's character tell a starkly different story, one where his carefully controlled demeanor was shaped by a childhood defined by fear, trauma, and political violence. According to the initial drafts, Tao was the son of a dissident who attempted to expose corruption within Hong Kong's elite power structures. When Tao was still a boy, he witnessed his father's execution, an image that became the defining scar of his life. A removed scene showed young Tao lighting incense in a dim room, silently mourning the one person who taught him the meaning of integrity. Another sequence, cut before filming began, featured Tao explaining the philosophy behind his empire. He believed power was not about domination, but about protection, the only way to prevent the world from stripping things away, as it did with his family. His rise within the criminal underworld was meant to feel inevitable, rooted in the desperation of someone who vowed never to be powerless again. Producers ultimately abandoned this storyline, worried that such emotional layers would make audiences sympathize with him too much and dilute the heroic arc of Brandon Lee's character. They chose instead to present Tao as an elegant but hollow antagonist, defined more by aesthetic menace than emotional depth. What remains on screen is a villain of composure and brutality. What was lost in the edit was the wounded boy who learned that survival meant taking control of a world that once destroyed his own. Fact 8. Showdown in Little Tokyo. In Showdown in Little Tokyo, Yoshida is portrayed as a flamboyant yet terrifying Yakuza boss, violent, theatrical, and unrestrained. But the earliest concepts surrounding his character reveal a completely different figure, one driven not by sadism but by a deep hunger to reclaim a family legacy buried in dishonor. Early drafts detail Yoshida's upbringing in Osaka, marked by poverty and humiliation after his father, a low-ranking Yakuza soldier, was executed in a dishonorable skirmish. The shame of that moment haunted Yoshida throughout his childhood. One removed montage traced his obsessive training, fueled not by cruelty but by a burning need to rebuild the reputation his family lost in blood. Another deleted interaction between Yoshida and Kenner showed them acknowledging the parallels in their pasts, two men molded by violence, both sons of tragedy. Their conflict was originally envisioned as a collision of two damaged individuals, each shaped by trauma but choosing different paths. However, the studio believed the film needed a more exaggerated, stylized villain, someone whose personality matched the movie's neon-soaked intensity. They cut the emotional backbone from Yoshida's character, removing everything that made him human and leaving behind a larger-than-life antagonist driven solely by intimidation. The Yoshida seen in theaters is a spectacle. The Yoshida originally written was a grieving son trying to resurrect a shattered legacy. Fact 9. Deadly Outbreak. In Deadly Outbreak, Baron bursts onto the screen as a volatile militant operating with explosive violence and unhinged aggression. But the earliest drafts of the film depicted him as a tragic figure, someone forged not by madness, but by betrayal and devastating personal loss. Originally, Baron was conceived as a highly skilled operative who led a covert team on a classified mission overseas. During that mission, political maneuvering back home cut off his support, leaving his unit stranded and slaughtered. A removed flashback showed Baron crawling through debris, dragging a fallen teammate while listening to radio chatter, confirming their abandonment. Another discarded storyline explored Baron's attempt to reconnect with his estranged daughter, a moment represented by a letter he carried with him, creased and worn. This subtle detail was meant to humanize him, revealing that beneath his rage was a man who had once tried to salvage a life outside war. Studio executives, however, felt this emotional weight clashed with the film's fast-paced action. They insisted on a version of Baron who was purely chaotic, an antagonist who didn't require audiences to understand him, only fear him. Thus, the emotional core of his character was erased. What remained was a violent, explosive villain, but the original Baron was a soldier betrayed by the very institution he once fought to protect. Fact 10. The Hunted. In The Hunted, Kinjo is presented as a near-mythic assassin, silent, ritualistic, and governed by a strict code that seems etched into his very being. But the earliest versions of the script drew a far more tragic portrait of the character, revealing that behind his stoic facade was a man who had been shaped, broken, and rebuilt through trauma from an early age. Originally, Kinjo's past was meant to expose the brutal origins of his loyalty to the Makoto clan. Early drafts described him as a young boy whose world collapsed during a political purge. A cut flashback showed the moment he was torn away from his home after witnessing the violent deaths of his parents. This traumatic abduction became the foundation of his transformation, marking the start of a life where emotional expression was punished and obedience meant survival. Another removed scene portrayed Kinjo washing blood from his blade in solitude, not with pride, but with a lingering sense of guilt he never dared to voice. His silence wasn't meant to represent calm mastery. It was emotional suppression crafted through years of conditioning. A planned conversation between Kinjo and the protagonist, Paul, further expanded their mirrored trajectories. Both were men scarred by violence, but Kinjo's path was carved by imprisonment in a world where humanity was a liability. The studio ultimately cut this emotional exchange, fearing it would complicate the narrative and reduce the mystery that made Kinjo so intimidating. The final film presents Kinjo as a ghostly force. But the original vision revealed a stolen childhood, a stolen identity, and a man who became a weapon because he was never allowed to become anything else. Fact 11. Excessive Force. In Excessive Force, Franco bursts onto the screen as a volatile, unpredictable mob figure, loud, theatrical, and cruel. But the early iterations of his character envisioned him as a far more tragic figure, shaped by betrayal and a desperate attempt to survive a system that discarded him long before he turned to violence. In its original drafts, Franco was depicted as a former informant who risked his life to help police dismantle a powerful criminal syndicate. However, after fulfilling his obligations, he was left unprotected. A removed flashback showed him recovering from a brutal ambush in a dingy motel room. Listening to a police scanner confirmed that he'd been abandoned by the very officers he'd helped. Another deleted subplot involved Franco trying to rescue his younger brother from the criminal world. Corrupt law enforcement manipulated the boy into illegal activity, and Franco's attempt to shield him became the emotional backbone of his descent. His brutality in the final version of the film was originally meant to represent a man lashing out against a system that had already destroyed everything he cared about. But the studio feared such complexity would muddy the film's moral landscape and humanize Franco too much. They stripped away all emotional context, recasting him as a traditional action movie antagonist whose motives were flattened into eccentric rage. The Franco audiences saw was chaotic. The Franco originally intended was a broken man, pushed into violence by betrayal on both sides of the law. Fact 12. Rage. In Rage, Mattson stands as a cold, calculating force, a government operative orchestrating chaos from behind closed doors. But the earliest vision for the character told a radically different story, one built on heartbreak, moral conflict, and the devastating collapse of a man who once believed in healing others. Early drafts depicted Mattson as a brilliant behavioral scientist whose work centered on treating trauma victims. Everything changed when a catastrophic explosion caused by reckless government experimentation took the lives of his wife and child. A removed sequence showed Mattson standing in the remains of his destroyed lab, clutching a scorched family photograph as he realized that the system he devoted his life to had betrayed him entirely. Another cut plotline revealed Mattson's attempt to sabotage the very program he was later forced to run. His rebellion was crushed by higher-ranking officials who threatened imprisonment if he didn't cooperate. Torn between conscience and survival, Matsson's descent into villainy was meant to feel tragic, not calculated. A powerful monologue never filmed had Matsson confess that he once believed his research could save lives, but grief twisted that hope into an obsessive desire for control. The studio removed this emotional layer, worrying it would distract from the film's fast-paced action rhythm. The theatrical version of Matsson presents him as a rigid, bureaucratic monster. But behind the unshot scenes was a man crushed by unimaginable loss, reshaped into something unrecognizable by the same system that shattered his world. Fact 13. The Presidio. In The Presidio, Colonel Lawrence appears on screen as a straightforwardly corrupt officer, someone whose actions seem rooted in greed and self-preservation. But earlier drafts of the story painted him as a man crushed long before he ever crossed the line into criminality. Originally, Lawrence was written as a highly decorated soldier who once led a classified rescue mission overseas. That mission spiraled into chaos when conflicting intelligence resulted in the deaths of several civilians. A removed flashback portrayed Lawrence standing in the aftermath, shaken and guilt-ridden as smoke and dust filled the air. Instead of being supported by his superiors, he was quietly assigned blame to shield higher-ranking officials from scrutiny. Another dropped subplot followed Lawrence's attempt to expose the corruption hiding within the chain of command. His loyalty to the truth was met with threats and reassignment. The betrayal shattered his faith in the institution he had devoted his life to. What the final film reduced to greed was originally the result of a man driven to reclaim control after being humiliated and discarded. A scripted confrontation between Lawrence and his former commanding officer added even more emotional weight, revealing his internal conflict. He never wanted to betray the military, but he felt the military had already betrayed him. The studio cut the scene for fear it would complicate the moral divide between hero and villain. In the final cut, Lawrence is nothing more than a corrupt officer. But in the version that never made it to film, he was a man battling the destruction of his own ideals. Fact 14. Silent Trigger. In Silent Trigger, the director comes across as an almost mythic presence, an unseen hand controlling operations from behind layers of monitors and steel. But the earliest scripts revealed a far more human version of the character, a former field operative whose life unraveled after a catastrophic mistake that cost him the lives of everyone he once commanded. Initially, the director was portrayed as a brilliant sniper team leader. During one mission, flawed intelligence covered up by bureaucrats seeking to protect themselves led to the death of his entire squad. A removed scene depicted him discovering the bodies of his team scattered across a rain-soaked rooftop. The moment broke him, shifting his worldview entirely. Instead of seeking therapy or retirement, he retreated into the shadows, convinced that emotion was a liability. He adopted a philosophy of total detachment, control everything, feel nothing. A cut monologue revealed that he saw precision as the only antidote to chaos, a belief born from the guilt he carried. Another abandoned subplot paralleled his trauma with that of the protagonist, positioning their battle as a collision of two damaged warriors shaped by similar wounds. Producers decided this made the villain too sympathetic, reducing the raw menace they wanted him to project. What remained in the final film was a distant mastermind, but the original version was a grieving commander clinging to control after losing everything. FACT 15. Mission of Justice. In Mission of Justice, Dr. Rachel Larkin is presented as an imposing ideological leader whose doctrine demands conformity and obedience. But the earliest concepts imagined her as a profoundly tragic figure, someone whose extremism was born not from ego, but from grief and disillusionment. In the original drafts, Larkin was a respected trauma surgeon whose confidence was shattered after a young patient died during a chaotic emergency procedure. The loss consumed her. A removed flashback showed her replaying the event over and over, unable to reconcile her expertise with the unexpected tragedy that unfolded before her eyes. Another dropped storyline followed Larkin as she sought solace in underground motivational circles, groups that twisted empowerment into rigid discipline. These sessions preyed on people in emotional crisis, and Larkin, desperate for meaning, absorbed their most extreme philosophies. She believed she had found a way to prevent future tragedy, reshape society into something strict, orderly, and unforgiving. A longer confrontation scene, cut before filming, revealed Larkin confessing that her doctrine wasn't about control, it was about eliminating the chaos that had once taken everything from her. The studio removed this layer of vulnerability, worried it would soften her and diminish her threat. On screen, she appears as a cold, relentless ideologue. But behind the scenes, she was a grieving doctor who transformed loss into ruthless conviction. Bonus fact, Cobra. In Cobra, the Night Slasher is remembered as one of the most terrifying villains of the 1,980 seconds, cold, savage, and seemingly driven by nothing but bloodlust. But early versions of the script revealed a drastically different interpretation of the character, one rooted in despair rather than insanity. Originally, the Night Slasher was conceived as a man whose life had been systematically torn apart. He was once an ordinary factory worker blindsided by mass layoffs during an economic collapse. Without income, he lost his home, his marriage crumbled, and he spiraled into isolation. In his desperation, he fell in with a radical group that preyed on vulnerable people like him, individuals whose sense of identity had been shattered by forces beyond their control. A removed monologue, rumored to have been filmed, showed him recounting how society forgot men like me, hinting at a once genuine desire for justice twisted into violent extremism. This monologue reframed the Night Slasher as a victim of manipulation, molded into a weapon by those who exploited his pain. But the studio feared humanizing him would undermine the brutal simplicity of Stallone's vision. They wanted a villain who radiated pure, unfiltered menace, a figure whose presence alone made audiences recoil. As a result, every trace of the Night Slasher's emotional origin was removed, leaving behind a chilling, primal antagonist devoid of context. The theatrical version shows a monster. But the version buried in drafts revealed something far more disturbing. A broken man transformed into a symbol of violence by a world that abandoned him. You've just uncovered the hidden truths behind 15 action villains whose erased backstories could have completely transformed their films. Now I want to hear from you. Which lost origin do you think would have changed the movie the most if it had stayed in? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'm always reading what you have to say. If you enjoy exploring the secrets Hollywood tries to bury, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the untold side of action cinema. More forgotten stories are already on the way.